Hello and welcome to this episode of Wharf Wide Web. Most people will have heard of the three main players in the story of the early canal systems: the 3rd Duke of Bridgewater, Francis Egerton, John Gilbert, and James Brindley, but we're not going to focus on them today. Today we're going to look at some of the more hidden stories behind the construction of the wharf and the canal. There was already a plan in place that would bring the Bridgewater Canal through Preston Brook and joining on to the Trent and Mersey Canal when they started digging in Worsley in 1758. But it wasn't until about 1770 that men with shovels actually arrived and started the work. To date, no one has ever seen any images of the canal under construction, but the public watched with fascination as the canal edged along, and there was a steady stream of visitors that have left us with vivid descriptions. A small fleet of boats moved along the growing canal, dedicated floating workshops for masons and carpenters, a blacksmith's forge aboard another, and a tool repair shop behind this. Another boat was cabined over to become a clerk's office and counting house, organising payments, and then there were more boats shuttling backwards and forwards, taking the spoil away from the worksite. Temporary locks were built in places so materials could be raised and lowered in valleys, and an early form of split dredger was built. There was also a small flotilla of icebreakers kept on standby.
A broad stem boat in which 7 or 8 people who swayed her with great force as she was drawn on by a mule, and at the same time struck any large pieces with clubs they held in their hands.
This is an icebreaker from much later on, from a narrow canal, but the principle was the same. Winters were longer and harder than they are today, with one of the biggest arguments against the Bridgewater Canal had been that, come freezing weather, a waterway with no natural flow would freeze solid and become useless. In the event, the Bridgewater and its men triumphed. During a frost where the ice was thick enough for a man to jump up and down without cracking it, the Irwell navigation froze solid and trapped a number of boats, while the Bridgewater boats carried on, although not without a casualty in the ice-breaking team.
One of them was drawn against the ice till she had a hole cut in her bottom that would have sunk her, had she not been immediately unladen.
Icebreakers would go on to be stored at key points on the canal, like here in this tunnel at Lymm. An icebreaker tunnel was built at Preston Brook too, although it was converted into a cellar for storing cheese later on. The bulk of the men in the construction were local lads from the areas that the canal passed through, and although today most people would call them navvies, at this early stage they would simply have thought themselves either labourers or more specific craftsmen like carpenters or masons. When they reached Preston Brook, there was already a flurry of building happening in the village under the watchful eye of Thomas Brock, the enterprising solicitor who had bought Preston Brook off the gentry just before the canal had arrived. This was not by accident. 2 of his uncles and at least 1 cousin were already working for the Duke in his legal team, and the whole family were firmly entrenched in the progress. Thomas Brock immediately set about modernising Preston Brook, ready for the inevitable boom, building a windmill, the Red Lion Inn, and a selection of workshops and cottages in different shapes and sizes, and laying the foundations for what would become the Stafford Warehouse. The canal team set up camp somewhere in the field behind the wharf, with easy access to the road and existing village facilities. We know from other canals that there would have been a shed built to act as a kind of hostel for some of the men, while others, especially those with wives and families, would have rented rooms in the village, and the engineers, Brindley included, took the finest rooms in the Royal Oak. This is an accommodation hut built over 100 years later during the construction of the Manchester Ship Canal, but the principle would have been much the same. By the time that the Bridgewater men arrived at Preston Brook, the tunnel diggers from the Trent and Mersey were already hard at work. Realising that the tunnels at Preston Brook and Harecastle would take the most effort, Brindley ordered them to be started first, and he had a team of 700 men divided between the 2 sites. The work was hard and dangerous, even by the safety standards of the 18th century, and many men were maimed and even killed. Company records have been lost, but we can identify 2 of the local men who probably lost their lives building the tunnel from the parish records. The tunnel was built under a number of little watercourses that slowed the work considerably and kept the risks high, especially as they kept putting water in the canal bed to make it easier to float materials in. In April 1774, some 600 feet in the darkness, a section of the roof collapsed, and it was reported that 22 yards of earth lately fell upon the water and stopped its course. No one seems to have been killed this time, but we don't know if anyone was hurt. It was around this time that the Duke siphoned off some of his own workforce to help with the tunnel, but it still took another year before the tunnel was finally opened and
A vessel of 50 tons burden was navigated through it laden with coals as far as Acton Bridge, to the great satisfaction of all the neighbouring inhabitants.
while the men had toiled in the dark of the hill, Brock and the Duke's men had been busy in the daylight building warehouses. At this early stage the wharf was still rather neat, with one large warehouse built to the same plan as the one at Castlefield, including having a small arm going into the building and a winch system to lift and lower cargoes to road level. On one side of this was an open shed for keeping china clay out the rain, and on the other was a depot for coal and stone, and offices for the ever-increasing number of clerks keeping tabs on all the goods. The other side of the bridge, Brock's warehouse, was quickly taken over by the Staffordshire Company, although this only lasted about 15 years before it and its uninsured contents, worth about $3 million in today's money, burnt down. While it was being rebuilt, the Duke quietly ordered a fire engine and a suitable enticement for wharfmen to drive it. The engine managed to survive to the 20th century, but appears to have vanished in the 70s. Bert Cooper described it thus.
There used to be a bar or rail at the side, and a similar one at the other side which was joined up. 8 men along the side worked it up and down, and that's where the pressure came from. They used to go to fires as far as Helsby, and it was horse-drawn. We used to have a book in the office showing payments made to the men going to the fires. It was ale money they got for that. It needed relays of men for the job. You needed about 30 or 40 men to keep it going. The water was not carried inside, but a suction pump went into the water supply, and they had to find a pond or big tub. But that little engine, I've seen it put water onto the top of a warehouse. It was a good one.
And on that note I shall leave you, but join me again tomorrow, and we'll look at the boats themselves.
At this point he's just dancing.